I never thought I would see him again, not like this, not on a cold street corner where life seemed to have forgotten him, and if I'm honest, where I had tried to forget him too. But there he was, sitting on the curb with his shoulders hunched, clothes hanging off him like they belonged to another man, another life, and for a moment I almost walked past because the face didn't match the memory I had carried for years. Yet something in the way he rubbed his hands together, the same nervous habit he had when he was worried, stopped me in my tracks, and when I said his name softly, barely, louder than my own heartbeat, he looked up with eyes that still recognized me before his pride could stop him. And in that second the world seemed to pause, traffic noise fading, people blurring into shadows, because this was the man who once planned our future on napkins in cheap cafes, promised me a home full of laughter, who swore he would never let me down, and now he was living on the streets, surviving on coins and kindness, and I asked him what happened, expecting excuses or bitterness or blame. But instead he smiled in that broken way that hurts more than tears and told me the truth I wasn't ready for, that after we separated he lost his job not because he was careless but because he couldn't get out of bed some days, that depression swallowed him quietly, that he pretended to be fine until pretending cost him everything, that when I left he didn't just lose me but the version of himself who believed he was worth loving. And as he spoke his voice trembled, not from the cold but from years of holding it all in. And he said he never blamed me, that loving me had been the best part of his life. But losing that love made him realize how empty he had been inside. Long before I ever noticed, and that's when my chest tightened because I remembered all the times I told myself he was lazy, unmotivated, not trying hard enough, all the times I thought leaving was strength when maybe it was just survival. And he looked down at his hands and said something that broke me completely, that what hurt the most wasn't sleeping on sidewalks or going hungry, but waking up every day knowing he used to be someone I believed in, someone who mattered to me, and now he was invisible to the world, and I felt tears burn my eyes because standing there I understood that love doesn't always fail loudly. Sometimes it fades quietly while two people are still trying in their own broken ways. And as I reached out to hold his hand, feeling how thin and cold it was, I realized I couldn't change the past or save him from everything he had lost, but I could acknowledge the truth we both avoided for years, that we didn't fail because we didn't love each other enough. We failed because we didn't know how to heal the parts of ourselves that were already breaking. And when I walked away that day, I cried not just for the man he had become, but for the two people we once were, full of hope, unaware of how fragile life could be, and how easily love can turn into regret when pain goes unheard. I thought walking away from him that day would bring me peace, some kind of closure, but instead his words followed me like a shadow I couldn't escape, echoing in my head late at night when the house was quiet and my thoughts were loud, and I kept seeing his eyes, not angry or resentful, just tired, as if life had been pressing on his chest for too long. And I realized that meeting him again had reopened wounds I never truly healed, because the truth is I didn't just leave him back then. I left the guilt, the unanswered questions, the part of me that wondered if love could have saved us if we had known how to ask for help. And days passed, but I found myself returning to that street corner, telling myself it was coincidence, that I just happened to be nearby, when really my heart was looking for him before my mind could stop it. And when I saw him again sitting in the same spot, I noticed things I missed before, the way he shared his food with another man who had even less than he did, the way he smiled at a small child passing by as if he didn't want the world to see his pain. And something inside me shifted, because this wasn't a man who had given up on life. This was a man life had given up on. And I sat beside him without saying much, just listening as he talked about the nights he spent staring at the sky, wondering where everything went wrong, about the shelters that were full, the jobs that never called back once they saw his address was nowhere, about how loneliness hurts more than hunger because hunger can be ignored, but loneliness reminds you every second that you are alone. And then he told me the part he didn't say the first time, that after I left he tried to end his life once, not because he wanted to die, but because he couldn't see a reason to keep living, and my breath caught in my throat because I had no words, no apology big enough, no explanation that could undo that kind of pain. And as tears slipped down my face, he gently told me not to cry, that he survived, that something inside him still wanted to live even when everything else fell apart. and he said that seeing me again didn't reopen the wound. It reminded him that once someone loved him deeply, and that memory alone had kept him going on nights when he thought he couldn't make it. And I realized then how complicated love really is, how it can hurt and heal at the same time, how even after endings it can still be a lifeline in ways we never intended. And I offered to help him, not in grand promises or dramatic gestures, but in small human ways: a warm meal, clean clothes, a doctor's appointment, a chance to be seen again. And he hesitated, pride flickering across his face, but finally nodded, not because he was weak, but because being strong for so long had exhausted him. And as we walked together, side by side, not as lovers but as two people connected by a shared past and a fragile present, I understood that sometimes life doesn't give us happy endings, it gives us second chances wrapped in quiet moments. And maybe love doesn't always mean staying together. Maybe sometimes it means showing up when it matters most, even if the story has already changed. Helping him didn't transform his life overnight the way stories like to pretend it does, and maybe that's what made this part even harder to live through, because progress came slowly, painfully, measured in small victories that most people would never notice, like the first night he slept indoors without waking up in panic, or the first time he ate a full meal and didn't rush through it as if someone might take it away. And I watched him struggle with things I never imagined, like filling out forms that asked for an address he didn't have, or sitting in waiting rooms where people avoided eye contact as if poverty were contagious. And every time he flinched at a loud noise or apologized for things that didn't need apologies, I felt the weight of how deeply the streets had reshaped him. And yet there were moments when the man I once loved peeked through, in his dry humor, in the way he listened carefully when others spoke, in how grateful he was for the smallest kindness. And one evening as we sat quietly after dinner, he finally told me the truth he had been avoiding, that the hardest part of rebuilding wasn't finding work or housing. It was forgiving himself for becoming someone he never wanted to be, that shame had wrapped itself around his identity so tightly that even hope felt dangerous, because hoping meant risking disappointment again. And as he spoke, I realized how often we judge people for where they end up without ever asking how heavy the road was that led them there. And I admitted something I had never said out loud before, that leaving him had haunted me too, that I spent years convincing myself I made the right decision because staying felt like drowning. But deep down I always wondered if I abandoned someone who needed help rather than distance. And he looked at me with a softness that broke my heart all over again and said he never wanted to be the reason I lost myself, that loving him back then came at a cost he didn't know how to repay. And in that moment I understood that neither of us were villains in our story, just two imperfect people carrying wounds we didn't know how to heal. And as weeks turned into months, our relationship settled into something new, something gentler, built not on promises of forever, but on honesty and boundaries, on understanding that caring for someone doesn't mean sacrificing your own survival. And watching him slowly regain pieces of his dignity taught me that healing isn't linear, that setbacks don't erase progress, and that people are more than their worst moments or their lowest points. And one afternoon he came to me with a quiet smile and told me he'd been offered a temporary job, nothing glamorous, just honest work, but his hands were shaking with pride. And I cried again, not because the journey was over, but because I saw proof that even after everything, life still had room for redemption. And standing there, I realized the truth that had taken me years to accept, that sometimes the purpose of love isn't to last forever, but to leave enough light behind that someone can find their way back when the darkness feels endless. As his life slowly steadied, mine began to change in ways I didn't expect, because helping him rebuild forced me to look at parts of myself I had ignored for years, parts that learned to survive by shutting down, by walking away before things became too heavy. And I realized that meeting him again hadn't just reopened an old chapter, it had rewritten how I understood love, responsibility, and forgiveness. And there were days when I questioned whether staying involved was a mistake, when fear whispered that I was stepping back into a pain I barely escaped. But every time doubt crept in, reality grounded me, because what we shared now wasn't the past. It wasn't dependency or broken promises. It was honesty, fragile and raw. And one night, sitting across from him in a small rented room that smelled of fresh paint and second chances, he told me something that finally released the knot in my chest, that he didn't want me to feel like I owed him anything, that my kindness wasn't a debt he expected me to pay forever, and hearing that lifted a weight I didn't know I was carrying, because for the first time I understood that love offered freely doesn't trap, it liberates, and as time passed, people around us began to notice the change in him. How he stood a little straighter, spoke with more confidence, laughed without immediately apologizing for it. And yet what moved me most was the way he began to forgive himself, slowly letting go of the shame that once defined him. And one afternoon he told me he had started helping others on the street, bringing food, sharing information, listening to stories that mirrored his own, and I saw purpose return to his eyes, not the fragile kind built on success or approval, but the quiet strength that comes from understanding suffering. And that's when it hit me that this journey wasn't about fixing him. It never was. It was about witnessing someone reclaim their humanity after the world tried to erase it. And in doing so, I reclaimed parts of my own, because through him I learned that compassion doesn't mean reopening every door. It means choosing to see people fully, without simplifying them into heroes or failures. And when we finally talked about our past without pain tightening our throats, we acknowledged that love alone isn't always enough to save a relationship, but it can still leave something meaningful behind. And as I watched him walk forward on his own path, no longer needing me to hold him upright, I felt peace instead of loss, because sometimes closure isn't about endings, it's about understanding, and I cried again, not from sadness, but from gratitude, for the painful lesson that taught me that even when love breaks, it can still teach us how to be kinder, braver, and more human in a world that desperately needs all three. By the time his life no longer revolved around survival, I realized the story had quietly shifted from rescue to release, and that was the part I hadn't prepared myself for, because watching someone you care about stand on their own again is beautiful, but it also forces you to confront the truth that your role was temporary, a bridge rather than a destination. And there were moments when nostalgia tried to confuse me, when old memories surfaced and asked whether this growth meant we were meant to find our way back to each other. But honesty answered faster than hope, reminding me that what we shared now was respect, not romance, gratitude, not longing. And one evening, as we sat talking about ordinary things, work frustrations, small dreams, the kind of conversations that once defined our relationship, he smiled gently and said he was finally learning who he was without needing someone to save him or someone to blame. And that sentence stayed with me because it marked the true end of our past, not with anger or regret, but with maturity, and I saw how far he had come when he spoke about the future without fear, about saving money, about maybe helping others formally one day, about living rather than merely surviving, and I felt proud in a way that didn't ache, because pride no longer carried ownership. And in that clarity, I understood something painful yet freeing, that love can transform into care without demanding permanence, that sometimes people meet not to stay forever, but to teach each other the lessons they couldn't learn alone. And as our meetings became less frequent, naturally, without drama, I noticed that I wasn't afraid anymore, not of abandonment, not of guilt, not of repeating old mistakes, because helping him had helped me too, teaching me boundaries without coldness, compassion without self-erasure, and forgiveness without denial. And the final time we hugged goodbye, there were no tears, only a quiet understanding that we had both survived something that once defined us, and walking away, I didn't feel like I was leaving him behind. I felt like I was finally walking forward with peace, knowing that sometimes the most meaningful love stories aren't the ones that last forever, but the ones that end with two people stronger, wiser, and kinder than they were before, carrying the truth that even broken paths can lead to healing if we're brave enough to face them. Even after our paths separated in that gentle, natural way, his story continued to live inside me, not as a wound but as a reminder, and I began to notice how differently I moved through the world, how faces on the street no longer blurred into the background, how I slowed down, listened more, judged less, because once you truly see someone at their lowest and watch them climb back up, you can't unsee the humanity in others who are still falling. And sometimes I would hear his voice in my head when I passed someone asking for help, reminding me that behind every cardboard sign is a story no one bothered to hear. And one evening, months later, I ran into him by chance, not on a sidewalk this time, but outside a small cafe, standing tall, dressed simply, his eyes clear. And for a second I didn't recognize him again, not because he looked broken, but because he looked whole, and he told me he had moved into a shared apartment, that work was steady, that he was saving slowly, and as he spoke there was no desperation, no need to prove anything, just quiet confidence. And that was when I knew our journey had reached its true ending, because he no longer needed my presence to validate his progress, and I no longer needed to witness it to feel at peace. And as we talked, he thanked me one last time, not for saving him, but for seeing him when he felt invisible, and those words hit deeper than anything else, because they made me understand that the most powerful thing we can offer another person isn't money or solutions, it's recognition, the simple act of saying you matter. And when we said goodbye that night, it felt lighter than all the others, like closing a book you loved without needing to reread the last page. And walking home, I reflected on how life doesn't always reward effort immediately, how people can lose everything and still find a way back, how endings can be soft instead of cruel. And I realized that finding my ex on the streets didn't just reveal his truth, it revealed mine, that love doesn't fail just because it changes form, that compassion doesn't weaken us, it expands us, and that sometimes the most meaningful chapters in our lives aren't about who we keep, but about who we help become themselves again, even if our role in their story was never meant to last beyond that moment. Years passed quietly, the way real healing always seems to do, without announcements or dramatic music, and his story slowly became something I carried with gratitude rather than ache. Yet every so often life found a way to remind me of that chapter, usually when I least expected it, like the day I received a short message from an unknown number telling me he had started volunteering full-time with an outreach program for people living on the streets. And as I read his words, simple and steady, explaining how he helped others navigate shelters, paperwork, and the long wait back into dignity, I felt tears rise again, not from sadness, but from the overwhelming realization that pain, when faced honestly, can become purpose. And I thought back to the man I first saw on that sidewalk, hunched under the weight of loss, convinced he was invisible, and the distance between that version of him and the person he had become felt almost unreal, yet deeply earned. And what struck me most was how he spoke about the people he helped, not with pity, but with respect, because suffering had taught him what no book ever could, that everyone is one fragile moment away from losing the life they recognize. And as I reflected on my own journey, I understood that meeting him again had reshaped me just as profoundly, because I no longer feared endings the way I once did, no longer clung to relationships out of obligation or guilt, and no longer confused love with responsibility. And I learned that compassion doesn't require self-sacrifice to the point of disappearance. It requires presence, honesty, and the courage to let go when the time is right. And one afternoon, while watching strangers pass by on a busy street, I realized how many lives brush against ours briefly, leaving marks we don't notice until much later, and how some people enter our story not to stay, but to teach us how to be better humans. And I thought about how close I came to walking past him that first day, how easy it would have been to look away, and how doing so would have spared me pain, but also stolen the chance to witness something extraordinary. And that realization stayed with me, shaping how I chose to live, how I chose to see others, how I chose to show up, because the truth he told me that day wasn't just about his fall. It was about the quiet strength it takes to survive shame, to ask for help, to forgive yourself for becoming someone you never planned to be. And as time continued forward, I no longer defined our story as a love story that failed, but as a human story that mattered, one where two people met again at the lowest point and walked away changed, carrying lessons that would ripple outward into lives neither of us would ever fully know. And sometimes, late at night, I still think of him, not with longing or regret, but with pride and peace, knowing that even in a world that often feels cold and indifferent, kindness can still alter the course of a life, and that sometimes the most powerful love we ever experience is the one that teaches us how to let go, how to grow, and how to see the worth in others long after the story we shared has ended. By the time I fully understood the meaning of everything that had happened, the world around me felt quieter but clearer, as if the noise of my old fears had finally settled, and I realized that this story didn't end with him finding stability or me finding peace. It continued in the subtle ways it reshaped how I loved, how I listened, and how I chose compassion over comfort, because once you witness someone rebuild themselves from nothing, you stop believing in simple narratives of success and failure, and you begin to understand life as a series of fragile balances that can tip at any moment. And there were days when I would see someone struggling and feel a familiar ache in my chest, not from guilt, but from recognition, knowing how easily that could have been any of us. And sometimes I wondered what would have happened if I had walked past him that first day, if I had protected myself from the pain instead of facing it. And the answer always came back the same, that I would have survived, yes, but I would have been smaller, less open, less human, and I realized that courage isn't always about staying or leaving. Sometimes it's about returning, about looking directly at what hurt you and choosing understanding instead of distance. And as my own life moved forward, new relationships, new dreams, new chapters I once thought I wasn't ready for, I carried the lessons quietly without needing to explain them, because not every truth needs an audience. Some are meant to live inside you and guide your choices without words. And I learned to love without trying to rescue, to care without losing myself, to walk away without closing my heart, and that balance became the greatest gift this experience gave me. And one day, standing alone in a crowd, I felt a deep sense of gratitude, not just for how far he had come, but for how far I had come too, because meeting him again didn't pull me backward. It pushed me forward into a fuller version of myself, one who understands that people are not their lowest moments, that endings don't erase meaning, and that even the most painful encounters can become turning points if we allow them to teach us. And as I continue to live my life, I know this story will always be part of me, not as a scar, but as a quiet reminder that empathy can change trajectories, that healing doesn't always look dramatic, and that sometimes the most powerful thing we can do is stop, look, and truly see the person in front of us, because you never know how one moment of recognition might echo through an entire lifetime. With time, this story stopped feeling like something that happened *to me, and began to feel like something that shaped me, quietly influencing the way I made choices long after the emotion settled. And I noticed that when life presented me with difficult people or complicated situations, I no longer rushed to label them as failures or disappointments, because I had learned how misleading a single moment can be, how a life reduced to one scene can hide years of effort, pain, and resilience. And sometimes I would catch myself thinking about how close we all live to the edge of change, how one loss, one illness, one moment of silence where help should have been can unravel everything we think is permanent. And that awareness didn't make me fearful. It made me gentler, more patient, more willing to pause before turning away. And I realized that the greatest shift wasn't in how I saw him or others like him, but in how I saw myself, because I stopped defining my worth by how much I could endure or how much I could save someone else, and instead learned to value honesty, boundaries, and presence. And there were moments when people asked me why that chapter mattered so much, why I spoke about it with such quiet intensity, and I never had a simple answer, because some experiences don't teach lessons. They change the lens through which you see the world, and I understood that finding my ex on the streets wasn't a coincidence meant to reopen old wounds. It was a reminder that life isn't linear, that people don't disappear just because we stop sharing a life with them, and that compassion doesn't weaken us. It strengthens our capacity to live fully, and as years continued to pass, the memory softened even more, becoming less about pain and more about connection, less about regret and more about gratitude. And I knew that no matter where life took either of us, that moment of recognition on a cold street would always matter, because it proved that even after endings, even after loss, two people can meet again, not to reclaim the past, but to honor it, learn from it, and move forward with a deeper understanding of what it truly means to be human. As this story reached its quiet conclusion, I realized that endings don't arrive with certainty. They arrive with understanding, slowly, gently, often long after the moment has passed. And what stayed with me most wasn't the shock of seeing him on the streets or even the transformation that followed, but the way that single encounter stripped life down to its most honest truth, that we are all fragile, all unfinished, all doing our best with the tools we have at the time. And I began to see how easily people disappear from our lives without ever truly disappearing from who we become. How love doesn't vanish just because circumstances change. It simply evolves into something less visible but no less real. And I understood that forgiveness is not about excusing the past or rewriting pain. It's about freeing yourself from carrying it forward, and in forgiving him and myself, I felt lighter than I had in years, because I no longer needed answers that would never come or apologies that had already been replaced by growth. And when I looked back on the woman I was before that encounter, I saw someone guarded, afraid of repeating mistakes, convinced that walking away was the only form of strength. But now I knew better. Now I knew that strength also lives in compassion, in presence, in the courage to face uncomfortable truths without trying to control the outcome. And this realization changed how I loved others, how I loved myself, how I allowed people to enter and exit my life without turning every good bye into a failure. And sometimes when I pass someone sitting alone on a sidewalk, I don't see a stranger anymore. I see a story still being written, a life paused between chapters, and I carry the hope that someone, somewhere, will choose to stop and truly see them, just as I once did, because the truth he told me that day didn't just make me cry. It taught me that humanity survives in moments of recognition, that dignity can be rebuilt, and that even the most painful reunions can become quiet blessings if we let them change us instead of harden us. And with that understanding, I move forward, not clinging to the past, not fearing the future, but grounded in the knowledge that empathy is never wasted, that kindness echoes longer than regret, and that sometimes the most meaningful stories in our lives are the ones that end not with reunion or loss, but with wisdom,